Good evening, scholars, families, and Pinellas County friends. I'm Matthew Bloom, the high school social studies content specialist. Welcome to Night at the Museum, a U.S. History EOC review. Tonight, we are at the Florida Holocaust Museum here in St. Petersburg as part of our PCS Connects Level Up initiative. We're excited tonight to be joined by three museum experts. We've got Kelsey Jagno, the museum outreach educator, Jara Lugo, the museum educator, and we're joined by Ursula Szapinska, who is the Director of Education and Research here at the museum. Ursula, can you tell us a little bit about the museum?
Thank you, Matt. Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled to be part of this initiative. I want to thank Matt Bloom and Pinellas County Schools for involving us. We have been working with Pinellas County Schools for many years on delivering Holocaust education to the classrooms. Our museum is almost 30 years old. So for close to 3 decades, we have been delivering Holocaust education in partnership with the Florida Department of Education to the classrooms across the state. We provide resources in print and digitally for all grades, and all our programs and resources are free to students and educators. Our museum is one of only 3 Holocaust museums in the United States accredited with American Alliance of Museums. So today you will learn about some of our most popular resources, and if you have questions, we encourage you to send them to the museum or to Matt, and he will be happy to share them with us.
Thank you, and we're excited. Scholars, before we get started, let's take a look at the content we're going to focus on for our review tonight. In this quick review, we're going to focus on 2 benchmarks, A.6.3 to analyze the impact of the Holocaust during World War II on Jews as well as other groups, and benchmark A.6.7 describe the attempts to promote international justice through the Nuremberg Trials. For our scholars, it's important that you listen for concepts like Jewish life before 1933, the rise of the Nazi power in Germany, Kristallnacht, emigration and rescue, and the aftermath, including the Nuremberg Trials. We're here at our first segment of the Permanent Museum in the Museum with Kelsey, who's going to overview Jewish life before Nazi control, the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, early persecution of Jews under the Nazis, and Kristallnacht. Thanks, Kelsey.
Thanks so much, Matt. We're happy to be here. The first thing I wanted to do to start us off is give everyone watching a working definition of what the Holocaust was. So the Holocaust was the systematic, state-sponsored, bureaucratic persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and their collaborators between the years of 1933 and 1945. So that's our working definition of what we're talking about today. Before 1933, Jewish life in Europe was vibrant, and there was no one specific way for someone to be Jewish in Europe during this time period. So you saw Jews living in cities, living in the country. You saw Jews who were very, very religious, who stuck to strict religious traditions. You also had Jews who maybe didn't practice all of the traditional Jewish holidays or stick strictly to Jewish religious tradition, and who were a bit more identified a bit more with their country of origin, who felt very nationally identified in a lot of ways. So it's important to know that there was not one way to be Jewish in Europe during this time period. And the reason why that's important is because really what the Nazis did coming in was try to group Jews all together under this one umbrella of this, what they considered this inferior race of people. And lots of persecution comes out of that ideology in this time period. So as we know, in 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933, and that dramatically shifts life for Jews in Germany during this time period. Another word that is really important for us to understand, and a concept that's important for us to understand, is anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Semitism did not start with the Nazis. The Nazis didn't invent anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism played a huge role in what was going to happen to the Jews between 1933 and 1945. So anti-Semitism, for definition purposes, is the persecution or hatred or hostility towards Jews simply for being Jewish, right? And a lot of that comes with these old, long-standing stereotypes about Jews that factored into Nazi ideology and is really what the Nazis used in order to other Jews in society.
Good evening, scholars, families,
so
and Pinellas County friends.
The laws and
Good evening, scholars, families,
the restrictions that are going to be placed on Jews, a lot of that is rooted in these old standing stereotypes in order to first remove Jews socially from German society, economically from German society, and then eventually we're going to start seeing Jews being physically removed from German society and European society once the Nazis start to invade other countries. So let's talk a little bit more about some specific laws that Jews were experiencing, restrictions Jews were experiencing during this time period. So beginning almost immediately after Hitler comes to power in 1933, the government of Germany centralizes within a very top sphere, right? So by 1934, Hitler is dictator of Germany. And basically what the Nazis say is what's going, right? So laws were put into place in order to restrict Jews and to other them out of society. This included Jews not being able to be part of certain professions, economic restrictions, assets like property and businesses being either taken away from Jews or boycotts against Jewish businesses. Jewish children were no longer allowed to go to public schools and were first sent to Jewish schools and then eventually were no longer allowed to go to school at all. So all of these restrictions were meant to continue to remove Jews from society so that, from other German citizens, othering them essentially. And then by 1935, we get a set of laws called the Nuremberg Grace Laws. And those are really hostile towards Jews and have a huge impact on the Jewish community in Germany. It essentially defines who is Jewish, and it also strips citizenship away from Jews in Germany. Now, all of these laws are happening in Germany at this time period, but as we know, the Nazis don't contain their power just in Germany. Eventually, we're going to see with the invasion of places like Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938, and then once the war starts in 1939, Germany and the Nazis are going to expand their power, and all of these laws that were happening over these years in Germany at this time period will immediately take effect into these other countries. And so you can see that as an example in this identification card right here. This is actually a card from someone who lived in Holland. So the Nazis did not invade Holland until 1940, but this identification card has a similar J stamp. You can see right here. This ID card was owned by a man named Sam Shriver, who was a survivor that donated a lot of his artifacts here to the museum. So it has this J stamp signifying Jew, and that's how Sam would have been identified as a Jew during this time period. Another thing I wanted to point out is that all of these laws were just compounding upon people, but it's really important for us to remember that Jews were innocent victims of the Nazi regime. They were innocent victims of this discrimination, of this anti-Semitism. This was not a reaction towards something Jews had done. This was simply this old-seated anti-Semitism taken to this new level of hatred and discrimination. And then, as we know, it eventually escalates even further, especially after Kristallnacht, which happens in November of 1938, November 9th, 1938. We get a massive outbreak of violence against Jewish communities in Germany and in the German-controlled areas of Austria and Czechoslovakia. And it led to thousands and thousands of synagogues and Jewish businesses being looted and destroyed, hence the night of broken glass that we know this as, the glass from windows being in the streets, that's what it was called. And a mass roundup of Jewish men sent off to concentration camps after this night. And really, historians, and if you listen to survivor testimony, many survivors will also talk about this particular incident as this turning point in the history, because up until that point, there was some hope that maybe things would get better, or maybe this wouldn't escalate to that point. But after Kristallnacht, it became very apparent that things were not going to get better in Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and eventually in Europe once the war starts. And I did just want to point out, we have some artifacts from Jewish religious artifacts that the Torah especially is from a synagogue that was destroyed in Czechoslovakia. So these are really important artifacts to our museum.
Thank you. And so one of the questions that we want students to make sure that they're considering is, who are some of the other victim groups of Nazi persecution at this time?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because there were other people that were targeted during this time period by the Nazi regime. And some of those victim groups include the Roma and the Sinti, who were also targeted as a racial persecution similar to the Jews at the time. You have homosexuals who were targeted for their sexuality, Jehovah's Witnesses who were targeted on the basis of their religious beliefs and their unwillingness, if they were unwilling to swear allegiance to the Nazi regime. And you also had groups like Poles and Slavs who were used later on as slave labor as well in the Nazi regime once invading parts of Poland and Ukraine and Russia and places like that. And the mentally and physically disabled, groups of people who were mentally and physically disabled were also targeted for murder by the Nazi regime during the Holocaust era.
Thank you. And scholars, let's go on and take a look as we continue our tour of the permanent exhibit. We're going to go meet Jara in our second segment for a look at emigration and rescue. So here we're here with Jara for our second segment here, where we're going to talk about and highlight the Emigration and Rescue section of the Florida Holocaust Museum's permanent exhibition. It includes artifacts on refugees to Shanghai, the Kindertransport rescue, and other emigration and rescue efforts during the Holocaust. Thank you for helping us.
Hi, yes. So as students begin to learn about the Holocaust, they may be wondering, asking questions about did other countries try to help the Jews in Europe as this was happening? Were people able to escape during this time to safer places? And while most governments around the world did very little in order to help the Jewish population in Europe at the time, there were some nations and individuals and groups that were upstanders, of people who made the choice to stand up for what was right, to help someone else in need, even when it was at their own risk and it was dangerous to do so. So one rescue effort was the Kindertransport, and the Kindertransport was a rescue mission that was led by Great Britain for 9 months prior to the start of World War II in 1939. And in the Kindertransport, about 10,000 children from Greater Germany and other surrounding territories, children that were at risk during the Holocaust and during the war, were transported to safety in Great Britain. And one of the children who was part of the Kindertransport was Liesl Scheck. And Liesl Scheck She's a survivor. She is a friend of the Florida Holocaust Museum and a speaker here at the Florida Holocaust Museum. She shares her story with audiences everywhere. And she was part of the kinder transport with her little brother, Walter. They were taken on the kinder transport to England. They were separated from their parents during this time. And before they left Austria to go to England on the kinder transport, her father gifted her this diary that you see center here, part of her collection. In it, he wrote an inscription, a message, just hoping that as she embarks on this new life and on this new journey, while she's separated from her family, that she's able to fill the diary with happy events and lucky events. Unfortunately, most of the children that went on the kinder transport were never able to see their families again. Liesel and her brother Walter were fortunate. They were able to reunite with their parents after the war, but this was not the norm. Another thing we want to highlight is the immigration efforts that happened during this time. People were trying to escape Nazi Germany. And one of the places that people were emigrating to was Shanghai, China. It was very difficult to leave Germany, occupied territories during this time, especially after World War II broke out. And the only city in the world that accepted refugees without visas was Shanghai, China. And by 1941, there were about 20,000 Jewish refugees in Shanghai. So Betty Ravenchakov and her family, they were part of this group of Jewish refugees that went to Shanghai. And here you see on your side, there is a resident certificate that belonged to Betty when she was a refugee there in Shanghai and during the war. Shanghai, China was actually occupied by Japanese forces during World War II, and Japan was an ally of Germany during the war. Japan was actually being pressured by Germany to exterminate the Jewish refugee population they had in Shanghai, and they resisted to do that, but the Japanese authorities created a ghetto in which they housed the Jewish refugees in Shanghai, and Betty and her family were forced to live in this ghetto, and they survived the ghetto. It was very awful conditions during the war, but they survived, and eventually, after the war, they were unfortunately found out that the rest of their family in Europe had been killed during the Holocaust. As a side note, a much happier story is that Betty Ravenchakov, she is a speaker here at the Florida Holocaust Museum. She's a survivor and she's still alive today. She left Germany when she was a young girl, and she said goodbye to her best friend. Her name was Anna Maria. And for 80 years, she had no idea what happened to Anna Maria. She always wondered what happened to her. She thought she had died during the Holocaust as well because she was Jewish. And they actually just reunited this last year, last November in 2020, and it's actually become an international story. It's really quite amazing. So they've reunited and rekindled their friendship from 80 years ago. They're so similar and alike, and it's just a bright story, in this awful heartache that they had to experience. Some other things. So one country that was an upstander, one whole country was Denmark. They actually were able to, when Denmark was occupied during World War II by Germany, they were actually able to protect for a while their Jewish population, protect them from these laws that were being enacted and put upon by the Nazi regimes. Eventually, when they were trying to deport the Jewish population there in Denmark, there was a whole resistant effort to smuggle out the Jewish population to safety. This is where you see this boat. This is a kind of replica of the kind of boat that they used to smuggle out the Jewish Danish people into Sweden to safety. And they were able to save almost their entire Jewish population, which is about 7,000 that way, which was a whole country, was an upstander.
Wow. And so You had mentioned this a little bit, but to go into a little bit more detail on it, why was it difficult to leave Germany to escape the Holocaust?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different reasons why it was difficult to leave Germany, right? So the Nazi regime had put all these laws into place that took away property and citizenship and rights away from the Jewish people. We're looking at this, knowing what happens. We're looking at, the Jewish populations probably had no idea, that what could have happened, nothing to expect. So, and it was very difficult to leave, right? There's many reasons why it would be difficult for them to leave. They didn't want to leave their families behind, or it was an economic hardship, etc. But also, as World War II started and Germany started to occupy a lot of territory throughout Europe, there was almost no place for them to go. Everywhere was being under Nazi control or allies of Germany. So it was very difficult during this time.
Thank you. So scholars, we're going to keep moving on in our tour of the museum, and we're going to head to our third segment. We're going to talk with Ursula about the last piece of our review for this evening. All right, scholars, so we're here in our last segment of our tour of the Holocaust Museum tonight, and Ursula is joining us again, who's going to discuss with us the efforts to bring perpetrators of the Holocaust to justice, what the end of the Holocaust and World War II meant for survivors, and the post-Holocaust legacy. Thanks, Ursula.
Thank you, Matt. So let's start with the Nuremberg Trials, and I want to start with some historical facts. The top Nazi leaders who survived the war were put on trial before the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, Germany. The Allies set up courts in their respective occupied zones of Germany, and in the American zone, the American military tribunals conducted additional trials, which became the subsequent Nuremberg trials. You will see on the screen images of artifacts pertaining to that history. It's very important for us at the museum to teach through artifacts. If you would like to look at them closer, I encourage you to go to our website and visit our virtual tour, or use our brand new app, where you will be able to look at those artifacts up close. We also have a database of our artifacts on the website, which you can explore for free as well. We really believe in biographies of artifacts. Every object, every photograph carries a story. So if you want to learn more about the trials, you can also do that through artifacts. Now, there were also other trials after the war in other countries, not just in Germany. And one of the more well-known one is the Eichmann trial in Israel, which you may have heard about. But it doesn't mean that every perpetrator or collaborator was put on trial. Many of them got away. They either escaped to other countries and assumed new identities, or went to their hometowns and carried on with their lives. To this day, you may hear on the news about individuals who are located in different countries, including the United States, who are moved to their respective countries where those crimes are prosecuted. And it shows that the system of justice, even decades after the Holocaust, is trying to have those individuals face the consequences of their actions. Now, what did the end of the war mean for Holocaust survivors? As you said, it's one of the major topics. It was a time of liberation. So on the one hand, the survivors were liberated, but for many of them, it didn't mean freedom because they couldn't go home due to local anti-Semitism, and they needed to start a life elsewhere. Many survivors spent years in displaced persons camps, waiting for a new chance to build a life in a new country. As I said, for many of them, it took long years. Now, also, all survivors faced tremendous trauma of losing their loved ones. They lost immediate families, uncles, aunts, cousins. Entire communities were wiped out. Some survivors realized that they were the only members of their families who survived. So they were all alone, and they needed to find the strength to rebuild their lives, which was very challenging. I want to draw your attention to one of the pictures on the wall behind me. I want to tell you about Magda and Emilia Sas. You can see them on your screens. Magda was deported from Hungary in 1944 along with other Hungarian Jews. She was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau with her two daughters, Emilia, who you can see in the picture, and Judith. Now, Judith was a teenager at the time, so during the selection, she was selected to work. She was transferred to other camps where she was forced to work. And Magda, as other parents with young children, was selected for death. So Magda and Emilia were murdered. Magda was only 38 at the time, and Emilia was 6 years old. I'm showing you this picture because at our museum, we translate statistics into human lives. It's always one life plus one life plus one life. So we try to retrieve identities of those who perished, and the stories about those who perished are passed on by survivors. Magda's other daughter, Judith, managed to survive in spite of horrific experiences, and she spoke about her mom and her sister for many years at the museum to students and to teachers. Judith is no longer with us, unfortunately, but her legacy lives on. So we can carry on her legacy and make sure that those personal stories are not forgotten, that Magda and Emilia and other victims are not forgotten. The spot where we're actually standing is very symbolic at our museum. There is a boxcar that's our main artifact, and across there's this big wall of images of victims who perished during the Holocaust and of survivors. So this symbolic spot inspires us to think about what we can learn from this history, what it means for us today to study this history. We have a section at our museum on the other side of the boxcar called Lessons for Today. And in that section, we look at post-Holocaust genocides and human rights violations, including in our country. So we investigate what happened, why we haven't learned those lessons yet, and what can we do to learn the lessons and to apply them to our lives today. When we think about the legacy of survivors, we are responsible for investigating what happened during the Holocaust. It's part of humanity, it's part of our history, a very difficult part of history. But we need to investigate what happened in order to draw lessons and to prevent it in the future. So everybody who's watching today is responsible for their part in learning those lessons. I encourage you to visit our website, to use our resources, and to think what you can do to stop hatred and violence. Genocide and human rights violations end with violence, but they start with words, thoughts, concepts, misconceptions, and we need to be able to stop that hatred there before it grows into violence. So I will leave you with this task. Young people will be responsible for shaping our society in the future, and with the help of educators, you have a big task on your shoulders, and we are happy to help you learn those lessons.
Thank you. And before we move on to some of our other practice pieces, there was something that you mentioned that brought a question to mind, and that question was, what challenges did Holocaust survivors face at the end of World War II?
Mm-hmm. That's a huge question, and I know we don't have much time, but let's remember about this dilemma, liberators versus free for survivors who could not go home because of anti-Semitism. Let's remember about the tragedy of losing their loved ones and having to rebuild their lives in those new circumstances when they were dealing with extraordinary emotional trauma that they did not have any psychological help for. Also, coming to a new country was challenging, without the language, without their loved ones. So I encourage you to use our Speakers Bureau. We are open 3 days a week, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. But we do not have school tours yet. Everything is done virtually, and our Speakers Bureau is very active virtually. So if you would like to find out how survivors in Florida manage to face those challenges, you can book a Holocaust survivor, and we will meet virtually with you in your classrooms.
Thank you. And for our scholars, we know that that's a lot for you to process and to think about as you review, but it's incredibly important for the end of course exam. What we want to move to next is something that we've done with our other Night at the Museum events, and we want to give you a chance to practice with some multiple choice questions to help you get ready for the end of course exam. And they're going to be formatted in a way that help you prepare so that you are ready for this test. So to do that, we're going to use Nearpod to help join these questions. So what you see on the screen is the code that you can use to join, and for our scholars, our families, and our friends, you can go to join.nearpod.com, or you can use the Nearpod app, and you'll use the join code 6MVQ8. If you're worried about dropping the live stream, or you're worried about the ability to log in and to do that, don't worry, it's okay. We've got the questions that we'll be able to post on the screen for you. So we're going to give you just a couple more seconds to join before we get started with our practice questions. With the first question. So our first question is, why were the Nuremberg Trials historically important? Was it that Adolf Hitler surrendered to Soviet troops and was then tried and convicted of war crimes? Was it that NATO was formed to prevent the spread of communism? Was it that Nazi war criminals were charged with crimes against humanity and tried before an international tribunal? Or was it that German civilians were forced to view the atrocities committed at the concentration camps? The answer to our first question was that it was Nazi war criminals were charged with crimes against humanity and tried before an international tribunal. For our second question, what did the Nazi Party use as pretext for organizing the nationwide anti-Jewish pogrom known as Kristallnacht? Was it Hitler's manifesto, Mein Kampf, the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's poor economic condition, or the assassination of a German diplomat? The answer to this question was the assassination of a German diplomat. And for our last question for practice this evening, what was the final solution of the Jewish question? Was it opening a second front in Western Europe? Occupying territories surrounding German borders? Deportation of European Jews to neighboring countries? Or a euphemism used by Nazi leaders to refer to their plan to annihilate European Jews? And the answer to our last question was that it was a euphemism used by Nazi leaders to refer to their plan to annihilate European Jews. With that practice over, and with our time winding down for our last night at the museum review, I wanted to remind all of our scholars of the resource available to them any time of day to keep practicing, to keep reviewing, and to keep making sure that you know what you need to know to be ready for the end of course exam. And we're talking about our U.S. History Review Center. This review center contains 65 different tutorials and reviews, along with vocabulary practice and sample assessment items that you can do on your own time to help you get ready for the U.S. History end of course exam. You can access this resource by logging into Clever, clicking on the High School Enrichment app. You want to enter your PCS email credentials like you normally would, and you'll navigate to the Social Studies link. When you click on that link, you'll have full access to quarter reviews and videos and EOC-specific reviews. I want to thank the museum. I want to thank Ursula and Kelsey and Jara for their support tonight in reviewing it. I want to remind the scholars that in addition to our review center, as Ursula had mentioned earlier, you can log on to the museum website and you can practice by their virtual tour there as well. So with that, we want to say goodnight, but most importantly, we want to say to our scholars, our families, and our friends, good luck on getting ready for the U.S. History end of course exam. We know that you've got this.